Good evening, friends. Tonight we'll drift into a slow and gentle journey through ancient Greek stories and whispered legends. Dim your lights, settle under your blanket, let the noise of the day fade away. And if this calm journey helps you relax, feel free to tap like and subscribe, only if it feels right. These are the tales that have been told for thousands of years, passed down through generations like soft lullabies. Stories of flowers that bloom from tears, rivers that flow between worlds, and quiet moments that changed everything. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is in your city right now. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, whether you're watching as the sun sets or when the stars are already deep in the sky. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, pull that blanket a little closer, and let's begin our gentle journey into the world of ancient Greece, where every story holds a secret and every secret holds a dream. There are moments in ancient stories when something beautiful grows from something sad. Tonight, you're about to discover one of those moments in a tale that begins not with drama, but with the simple sound of friends laughing together on a warm afternoon in ancient Greece. Picture this: two young men walking across a wide, grassy field. The sun sits high and comfortable in the sky, the kind of afternoon sun that makes you want to lie down in the shade and watch clouds drift by. One of these friends is Apollo, the god of music and light, though right now he doesn't look much like a god at all. He's just walking, sandals crunching softly on the dry grass, talking and joking with his companion. The other young man is Hyacinth, and if you could see him, you'd understand why Apollo enjoys his company so much. Hyacinth has the kind of easy smile that makes everyone around him feel lighter. He's the friend who remembers your stories, who laughs at your jokes, who makes ordinary moments feel special just by being there. But here's what's interesting about this friendship, and what makes it different from the dramatic tales you might expect from Greek mythology. These two don't spend their time on grand adventures or heroic quests. Instead, they do the simple things that real friends do. They walk, they talk, they compete in gentle, playful ways. Today they've decided to throw the discus. Now, if you've never seen a discus, imagine a heavy, flat, round piece of metal or stone smooth in your hands. The Greeks loved throwing the discus because it required both strength and grace. You couldn't just muscle it through the air, you had to find the perfect balance, the right rhythm, the exact moment to let go. Apollo picks up the discus first. As a god, he could probably throw it clear across the mountains if he wanted to. But that's not the point today. Today, he's just a friend showing off a little, the way friends do. He winds up, spins and releases. The discus flies through the air in a perfect arc, landing with a soft thud in the grass far away. Hyacinth claps and grins. Not bad for someone who spends all his time playing the lyre, he teases. Apollo laughs, and there's something wonderful about hearing a god laugh like any ordinary person, warm and genuine and a little bit silly. Now it's Hyacinth's turn, and this is where you need to pay attention, because this moment, this very ordinary moment of a young man picking up a discus on a sunny afternoon, is about to become one of the most famous moments in all of Greek mythology. Hyacinth hefts the discus, feeling its weight. He's done this hundreds of times before. The motion is familiar, the wind-up, the spin, the release. He throws, and the discus flies beautifully through the air. For a moment, everything is perfect. The throw is strong and true, and Apollo starts to cheer, but then something goes wrong. Something that happens so quickly, so unexpectedly, that neither friend has time to react. The discus hits something, maybe a rock, maybe just an uneven patch of ground, and it bounces. Not just bounces, but ricochets, spinning back through the air in a direction no one could have predicted. And Hyacinth, still watching his throw with pride, never sees it coming. The discus strikes him in the head, and he falls. Just like that. One moment he's laughing with his friend, and the next moment he's lying still in the grass, his dark hair spread around him like spilled ink. Apollo rushes to his side, and this is where the story becomes both heartbreaking and beautiful at the same time, because Apollo is a god of healing, among other things. He has power over medicine, over life itself. His hands can cure diseases, mend broken bones, bring people back from the very edge of death. But he cannot save Hyacinth. Imagine Apollo's hands shaking as he tries everything he knows. Imagine him calling upon all his divine power, all his knowledge, all his desperate love for his friend. But sometimes, even gods have limits. Sometimes, even gods have to face the one thing they cannot change. As Hyacinth dies in his arms, Apollo makes a decision. If he cannot save his friend's life, he will at least make sure that Hyacinth is never forgotten, that something beautiful will remain in the world to remember this young man who made everyone around him feel lighter. And so, as Apollo's tears fall onto the ground where Hyacinth's blood has spilled, something magical begins to happen. The earth, soaked with both grief and love, starts to change. A small green shoot pushes up through the soil, then another, then more. Within moments, flowers begin to bloom. But these aren't just any flowers. They're unlike anything that has ever grown on Earth before. Deep purple petals, almost blue in the right light, clustered together on tall, graceful stems. Beautiful enough to make you stop and stare. Fragrant enough to make you close your eyes and breathe deeply. Apollo names them hyacinths after his friend. And here's the detail that makes this story even more special. If you look closely at the petals of a hyacinth flower, you can see markings that look almost like letters. The Greeks believed these markings spelled out A-I-I-A-I, an ancient expression of grief and loss. So every hyacinth that has ever bloomed since that day carries within its petals the story of friendship, of loss, and of love that transforms tragedy into beauty. Every spring, when hyacinths push up through the soil in gardens around the world, they're telling Hyacinth's story all over again. But here's what I find most beautiful about this myth. It's not really about the magical transformation at all. It's about the moment when Apollo realizes that the best way to honor someone you've lost is to make sure their memory brings something good into the world. Think about that for a moment. How many times have you seen something beautiful, a flower, a sunset, a piece of music, and felt like it was somehow connected to someone you cared about? The Greeks understood that feeling. They understood that love doesn't end when someone dies, it just changes form. And so Hyacinth, who in life made his friends feel lighter and happier just by being himself, continues to do the same thing in death. Every time someone sees a hyacinth flower and smiles, every time someone stops to breathe in that sweet fragrance, Hyacinth is still making the world a little brighter. Apollo went on to become one of the most important gods in all of Greek mythology. He had many adventures, many other friends, many other stories, but he never forgot that afternoon in the grass, and he never stopped making sure that hyacinths bloomed every spring. The ancient Greeks would plant hyacinths near their homes, not just because they were beautiful, but because they represented the idea that love is stronger than loss. That friendship can survive anything, even death. But sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply remember and let that memory grow into something beautiful. And if you've ever wondered why we still give flowers to people we care about, why we plant gardens to remember those we've lost, why we find comfort in the simple act of watching something beautiful grow, well, maybe it all started with Apollo, kneeling in the grass, watching the first hyacinth bloom where his friend had fallen. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you might find yourself thinking about those flowers, about the way beauty can grow from sadness, the way love can take new forms, the way a simple friendship between two young men in ancient Greece became a story that people still tell thousands of years later. And maybe, just maybe, you'll wonder what other quiet miracles are growing all around us if we just know how to look. Sometimes the most important journeys begin not with a single step, but with a single breath, the last breath of a mortal life, followed by the first glimpse of something that lies beyond our everyday world. In the previous story, we saw how love could transform tragedy into eternal beauty. Now, let's follow a different kind of transformation, one that every soul in ancient Greece knew they would someday make, down a winding path to the most famous river in all of mythology. The river Styx flows through the underworld like a dark ribbon, separating the land of the living from the realm of the dead. But here's what makes this river truly special. It's not just a boundary, it's a river of power, of magic so strong that even the gods themselves would swear their most solemn oaths upon its waters. Picture this. You're standing on a grey, misty shore, and before you stretches water so dark it looks almost black. Not frightening black, but the deep, quiet black of night sky reflected in still water. The air here doesn't feel cold exactly, but it feels different, thinner, as if it carries whispers from both the world you've left behind and the world you're about to enter. This is where every soul comes, eventually. Rich or poor, young or old, hero or ordinary person, everyone must cross the Styx to reach the underworld, and waiting at the water's edge, probably sitting in the most famous boat in all of mythology, is Charon the ferryman. Now, If you're imagining some terrifying figure with glowing eyes and a dramatic cloak, let me surprise you. Charon looks more like a grumpy old fisherman who's been working the same job for thousands of years. His beard is grey and unkempt, his clothes are practical and worn, and he has the expression of someone who's heard every excuse, every plea, every joke that passengers think might be original. He's been ferrying souls across this river since the beginning of time, and he's developed what you might call a professional attitude about it. No nonsense, no drama, just, do you have your fare? Good. Get in the boat, hold on, don't rock the boat. We'll be there in a few minutes. But here's where the story gets interesting. The fare Charon requires isn't gold or silver from some treasure chest. It's a single coin, usually placed on the eyes or under the tongue of the deceased by their family. Just one small coin for passage across the river that separates all of existence. And what happens if you don't have that coin? Well, this is where Charon's job gets a bit more complicated. You wait, maybe for 100 years, maybe for 1,000. You become one of the restless spirits wandering the shores of the Styx, watching boat after boat carry other souls across while you remain stuck between worlds. The ancient Greeks took this very seriously. Families would make sure to place that coin with their loved ones not out of superstition, but out of love. The idea of someone they cared about being trapped, unable to complete their final journey, was unbearable. But let's climb into Charon's boat and see what this crossing is really like. The boat itself is old but sturdy, worn smooth by countless hands. It rocks gently as you step in, and Charon nods toward a wooden bench. "Sit there," he says in a voice like gravel. "Don't lean over the sides, don't try to touch the water, and don't ask me how much longer. We get there when we get there." As the boat begins to move, you notice something strange about the water. It's completely still except for the small ripples created by Charon's oar. No fish jump, no insects skim the surface, no birds dive for prey. It's water, but it's also something more, something that exists between life and death, between mortal and divine. And here's one of the most fascinating things about the Styx. The gods fear this river. Not fear as in terror, but fear as in deep, respectful caution. Because the Styx has power over them that few other things in the universe possess. When a god swears an oath on the waters of the Styx, that oath becomes absolutely binding. Break it, and face punishment so severe it makes even Zeus think twice. The god who breaks a Styx oath loses their voice for a year, then falls into a coma-like sleep for 9 more years, cut off from all divine privileges and powers. Imagine being Zeus, ruler of the universe, and still having to be careful about what promises you make because of this dark, quiet river flowing through the underworld. It tells you something about the true nature of power, that even gods must answer to something greater than themselves. The strangest story about the Styx involves a sea nymph named Thetis and her baby son, Achilles. Thetis heard prophecies that her child would die young in a great war, and she couldn't bear the thought. So she decided to make him immortal by dipping him in the waters of the Styx. Think about this moment. A mother, desperate to protect her child, carrying a baby to the banks of the most dangerous river in existence. The Styx doesn't grant immortality gently. Its magic is harsh, absolute. One dip in those dark waters, and mortality burns away forever. Thetis held her son by the heel and lowered him into the river. The baby cried. Who wouldn't, being dunked in magical water that feels like liquid starlight mixed with winter rain? But as the Styx flowed over his body, something incredible happened. His skin became harder than bronze, his flesh tougher than iron. Arrows would bounce off him, swords would shatter against his chest. But here's the detail that changed everything. The spot where Thetis held him. His heel never touched the water. That one small place remained mortal, vulnerable, human. Years later, Achilles would become the greatest warrior in the Trojan War, seemingly invincible in battle. But in the end, one arrow to that unprotected heel would bring him down. All that power, all that divine protection, undone by the one place his mother's love couldn't reach. Back in Charon's boat, as you drift across the dark water, you might wonder what it would feel like to trail your hand in the Styx. Would it tingle with magic? Would you sense the oaths of gods echoing in its depths? Would you feel the boundary between life and death flowing between your fingers? Charon would probably smack your hand away before you could find out. "I told you not to touch the water," he'd grumble. "Do you want to become immortal by accident? Do you have any idea how much paperwork that creates for me?" Because here's something the myths don't always mention. Being immortal isn't necessarily a gift. It means watching everyone you love grow old and die while you remain unchanged. It means carrying memories of loss for centuries, millennia, forever. The gods knew this. That's why they rarely granted true immortality to mortals, even those they loved. As Charon's boat reaches the far shore, you step out onto ground that no living person has ever touched. Behind you, the Styx continues its eternal flow, carrying secrets between worlds. Ahead lies whatever comes next in the journey of the soul. But before you continue on, you might turn back for one last look at the river. In its dark waters, you can almost see reflections of everyone who's ever made this crossing. Heroes and cowards, kings and peasants, the famous and the forgotten, all equal here, all simply souls making the same ancient journey. The Greeks believed that understanding the Styx meant understanding something fundamental about existence itself. That there are boundaries that must be respected, oaths that must be kept, journeys that must be completed, that even gods are subject to laws greater than themselves, and maybe, as you settle into sleep tonight, you'll dream of dark water flowing quietly between worlds, carrying whispers of promises kept and secrets held, reminding you that some things in this universe are bigger than any of us, and yet somehow, mysteriously, they exist to serve the simple, universal need to find our way home. There's something haunting about a river that grants immortality, but what happens when immortality comes not as a gift but as a curse? Our journey across the Styx has brought us to a story about transformation that goes wrong, about beauty that becomes terrible, and about a young woman whose name has echoed through centuries for all the wrong reasons. Before Medusa became the monster whose gaze could turn people to stone, she was simply a young woman with the most beautiful hair anyone had ever seen. Picture it, long lustrous locks that caught sunlight like spun gold, hair so lovely that people would stop on the street just to watch her walk by. Medusa worked as a priestess in the temple of Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare. This wasn't just any job, it was a sacred calling that required a vow of chastity, a promise to dedicate your life entirely to serving the goddess. The temple itself was a place of marble columns and cool shadows, where the air always smelled faintly of olive oil from the sacred lamps. Every morning Medusa would wake before dawn to tend these lamps, sweeping the temple floors with careful, meditative strokes. She would arrange fresh flowers on Athena's altar, polish the bronze offerings until they gleamed, and prepare for the worshippers who would arrive as the sun rose higher. It was peaceful work, the kind that lets your mind wander while your hands stay busy. Medusa loved the quiet moments between ceremonies, when she could stand in the temple courtyard and feel the morning breeze lift her hair around her shoulders. And here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Poseidon, god of the sea, noticed Medusa, and when gods notice mortals, it rarely ends well for the mortals involved. Poseidon was not known for his patience or his respect for others' choices. He was the kind of god who took what he wanted and dealt with the consequences later, if he bothered to deal with them at all. When he saw Medusa in Athena's temple, her beautiful hair gleaming in the lamplight, he decided he wanted her. What happened next was assault, pure and simple. Poseidon forced himself on Medusa right there in the sacred temple, violating both her and the sacred space she had sworn to protect. It was a crime that should have brought down divine punishment on the sea god himself, but instead, something unthinkable happened. Athena, the goddess Medusa had served faithfully for years, blamed Medusa for what had occurred in her temple. Try to imagine this moment. You're a young woman who has just survived something terrible, something that wasn't your fault, something that has left you traumatized and seeking help. And the person you turn to, the goddess you've dedicated your life to serving, looks at you with disgust and says it was your fault. Athena's reasoning was that Medusa had somehow defiled the sacred temple by allowing herself to be assaulted there. Never mind that she had no choice in the matter. Never mind that Poseidon was the one who had violated both her and the sacred space. In Athena's mind, Medusa was the one who needed to be punished, and so Athena cursed her. The transformation didn't happen all at once. First, Medusa felt a strange tingling in her scalp, as if tiny insects were crawling through her hair. She reached up to touch her head, and felt something that made her heart stop. Her beautiful hair was moving on its own. Strand by strand, Her lovely locks began to change. They thickened, coarsened, and then, impossibly, began to writhe and hiss. Her hair was becoming snakes, living snakes with tiny fangs and glittering eyes growing directly from her scalp. But that was only the beginning. Athena wasn't finished with her punishment. Medusa's skin began to change next, taking on a greenish, scaly appearance. Her fingernails grew long and sharp like claws. Her teeth became fangs. But the worst change was saved for last. Her eyes. Those eyes, which had once looked upon the world with kindness and wonder, now carried a terrible power. Anyone who looked directly into Medusa's gaze would instantly turn to stone. Not die. That would almost be merciful. Instead, they would be frozen forever in their last moment of life, aware but unable to move, speak, or even blink. Can you imagine realizing what was happening to you? The first time Medusa looked into a mirror and saw what she had become, the first time someone looked at her and she watched in horror as they transformed into a statue right before her eyes. Medusa fled from the temple, from the city, from anywhere that people might accidentally see her. She found a cave on a remote island, a place where she could live alone without endangering anyone else. The cave was cold and damp, nothing like the beautiful temple she'd called home, but at least here she couldn't hurt anyone. Years passed, decades. Medusa lived in complete isolation, talking only to the snakes that had replaced her hair. They at least weren't affected by her gaze. They would whisper to her in their hissing voices, though whether they offered comfort or just echoed her own tortured thoughts, she could never be sure. The island around her cave slowly filled with stone statues, not people who had come seeking her, but birds who had happened to fly overhead, fish who had jumped from the sea at the wrong moment, even plants that had somehow caught her reflected gaze in a pool of water. Her very existence was turning the world around her into a graveyard of stone. And the cruelest part of the curse, Medusa remained essentially human inside. She still felt loneliness, still remembered what it was like to have friends, still longed for simple human connection. But she could never have any of those things again. One look from her would destroy anyone she might have cared about. The ancient Greeks who first told this story understood something profound about injustice. They knew that sometimes terrible things happen to good people through no fault of their own. They knew that the powerful sometimes blame the powerless for their own crimes, and they knew that victims are often punished while perpetrators go free. Medusa's story is about all of those things, but it's also about something else, survival. Because despite everything that happened to her, despite being transformed into something the world saw as monstrous, Medusa survived. She found a way to live with her curse, to exist in a world that had rejected her. She couldn't change what had been done to her, but she could choose how to respond to it. She chose to isolate herself to protect others, even though that isolation was a kind of living death. She chose to endure, even when endurance seemed impossible. When heroes eventually came seeking her, Perseus most famously among them, they saw only a monster to be slain. They never bothered to learn her story, to understand what had made her what she was. To them, she was just an obstacle to overcome, a trophy to win. But perhaps we can see her differently. Perhaps we can see Medusa not as a monster, but as a survivor of terrible injustice who found a way to keep living despite everything that had been taken from her. Her snakes hiss warnings to protect others from her gaze. Her isolation is a form of self-sacrifice, choosing loneliness to prevent harm. In some versions of the myth, when Medusa was finally killed, beautiful winged horses sprang from her blood. Even in death, something beautiful could emerge from her story. Even after a lifetime of being seen as monstrous, she could give birth to wonder. Tonight, as you consider Medusa's tale, you might think about the difference between how we see ourselves and how the world sees us. About the invisible burdens that people carry, the stories behind faces that make others turn away. About the strength it takes to survive when survival itself seems like a punishment. And maybe you'll wonder, what other monsters in our myths and legends were once just people who had terrible things happen to them? What other stories of transformation hide deeper truths about justice, power, and the courage it takes to keep living when the world has turned against you? After walking with Medusa through her dark transformation, it's time to turn toward a different kind of change. One born not from punishment or cruelty, but from the deepest kind of creative love. Sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with someone working alone in a quiet room, their hands shaping something that doesn't yet exist. Pygmalion was a sculptor living on the island of Cyprus, and if you could have watched him work, you would have understood immediately that this was someone who saw the world differently than everyone else. Where others saw a rough block of marble, Pygmalion saw a face waiting to be freed. Where others saw stone, he saw possibility. His workshop was filled with the gentle sounds of creation. The soft tap-tap-tap of chisel against stone, the whisper of sandpaper smoothing a curved surface, the almost musical ring of hammer on chisel. Marble dust danced in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through his windows, and half-finished sculptures stood around the room like a congregation of sleeping figures. But Pygmalion had grown disillusioned with love. He'd watched the women of Cyprus worship Aphrodite in ways that struck him as shallow and vain. He'd seen relationships built on nothing more substantial than physical attraction, partnerships that crumbled the moment real challenges appeared. Love, as he observed it, seemed to bring out the worst in people rather than the best, so he decided to avoid romantic love entirely. Instead, he would pour all his passion into his art. He would create beauty rather than chase after it in the imperfect form of human relationships. And then one day he began working on a sculpture that was different from all the others. It started as an impulse, really. He had acquired a block of the finest marble he'd ever seen, white as fresh snow, with veins that caught the light like captured moonbeams. As he studied the stone, turning it this way and that, an image began to form in his mind, not copying any real woman he had ever seen, but creating someone entirely new. Day after day, Pygmalion worked on this sculpture. He would arrive at his workshop before dawn and barely notice when the sun set. His neighbours would sometimes hear him talking to himself as he worked. Though he wasn't really talking to himself at all, he was talking to her, to the woman he was slowly freeing from the marble. As weeks turned to months, something extraordinary took shape under his hands. The sculpture was life-sized, depicting a young woman of such beauty that visitors to his workshop would gasp when they first saw her. But it wasn't just her physical perfection that took people's breath away. It was something else, something harder to define. Pygmalion had somehow managed to carve personality into stone. The slight tilt of her head suggested curiosity. The curve of her lips hinted at a sense of humour. Her eyes seemed to hold depths of kindness and intelligence. She looked like someone you would want to. No, someone who would understand your jokes and remember your stories. When the sculpture was finally complete, Pygmalion found himself spending more and more time just looking at her. He would sit in his workshop in the evenings, surrounded by flickering oil lamps, and simply gaze at his creation. She was perfect, not just physically, but in every way he could imagine a person being perfect. And slowly, without quite realising what was happening, Pygmalion fell in love. Not with the sculpture as an object, but with the woman he had imagined into existence. He began talking to her as if she could hear him, telling her about his day, sharing his thoughts about art and beauty and life. He would bring her small gifts, flowers for her hair, jewellery to adorn her marble arms, beautiful fabrics that he would drape around her shoulders. His neighbours began to worry. They would see him in the marketplace, buying perfume and cosmetics, choosing items with the careful attention of someone selecting gifts for a beloved. But everyone knew that Pygmalion lived alone. Who were these gifts for? The truth was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Pygmalion was living in a love affair with someone who existed only in his imagination and his art. He would kiss her marble lips, though they remained cold as stone. He would whisper endearments to her marble ears, though she could never whisper back. He had created the perfect woman, and she would always be perfectly out of reach. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The festival of Aphrodite was approaching, and despite his previous cynicism about love, Pygmalion found himself walking to the goddess's temple, not to worship in the ways that had once disgusted him, but to make a prayer that came from the deepest part of his heart. Standing before Aphrodite's altar, surrounded by other worshippers, Pygmalion made a request that he barely dared to voice, even to himself. "Goddess," he whispered, "if you have any power over the impossible, let me find a woman like my sculpture, someone who embodies all the beauty and goodness I've tried to capture in stone." He couldn't quite bring himself to ask for the real miracle he wanted, for his sculpture to come to life. That seemed too impossible, too much like the fantasies of a madman. So he asked for something that seemed more reasonable, to find a real woman who could make him feel the way his marble creation did. Aphrodite heard his prayer, and she understood what he really wanted, even if he couldn't say it aloud. The goddess of love recognised something pure in Pygmalion's devotion. This wasn't shallow infatuation or selfish desire. This was love in its most creative form, love that had shaped beauty from nothing, love that asked for nothing in return but the chance to give more. When Pygmalion returned to his workshop that evening, something was different. The air itself felt changed, charged with possibility. The marble sculpture seemed to glow in the lamplight, and for a wild moment he could have sworn he saw her chest rise and fall as if she were breathing. He approached her slowly, almost afraid to look too closely, afraid that the trick of the light would disappear. But as he drew near, he noticed something that made his heart race. Her marble skin looked softer somehow, more yielding. The rigid perfection of stone seemed to be giving way to something more human. Hardly daring to believe what he was seeing, Pygmalion reached out to touch her hand. Instead of cold, hard marble, he felt warm, yielding flesh. Her skin was soft as silk, warm as sunlight. And as he watched in amazement, her eyes opened, real eyes, brown as rich earth, looking directly into his with unmistakable awareness. She drew her first breath, a small surprise sound, and then she smiled. It was the same smile Pygmalion had carved into marble, but now it was real, animated by genuine joy and wonder. She looked around the workshop, taking in her surroundings with the curiosity he had tried to capture in stone, and then her gaze returned to his face. "Hello," she said, and her voice was everything he had imagined it would be, warm, intelligent, kind. Pygmalion named her Galatea, which means white as milk, though she was far more than just beautiful. She was exactly who he had imagined her to be when he carved her features. Curious about the world, delighted by small pleasures, quick to laugh, easy to talk to. She was, in every sense, the woman of his dreams made real. Their love story became legendary throughout Cyprus. Here was a couple who truly understood each other, because one of them had literally created the other to be their perfect complement. Galatea brought Pygmalion's artistic vision to life, while Pygmalion gave Galatea the gift of existence itself. But perhaps the most beautiful part of their story is what it suggests about the nature of love and creation. Pygmalion's love for Galatea began not with her physical beauty, but with his vision of who she could be. He fell in love with her character, her personality, her essence, all the things he had imagined and then carved into marble. And Galatea, when she came to life, wasn't a blank slate or an empty vessel. She was fully herself from the moment she opened her eyes, complete with all the qualities Pygmalion had envisioned. She was both his creation and her own person, both the answer to his prayer and an independent being with her own thoughts and feelings. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you might think about the things we create with love, not just sculptures or paintings, but the ways we imagine the people we care about, the futures we hope for, the beauty we try to bring into the world. Sometimes the most powerful kind of love is the kind that sees what could be, rather than just what is, the kind that shapes possibility into reality through patient, devoted work. And maybe you'll wonder, what marble is waiting in your life for someone to see the figure hidden inside? What dreams are you slowly, carefully shaping with your own hands, hoping that someday they too might draw breath and step into the world? Love can create miracles, as Pygmalion discovered, but it can also destroy entire civilizations. From the workshop where stone became flesh, we turn now to a different kind of creation story, one where cleverness and wood combined to bring down the most famous city in all of ancient literature. The Trojan War had been going on for 10 long years, and everyone was tired. Not just the soldiers, though they were certainly exhausted from a decade of fighting, but the wives waiting at home, the children who had grown up knowing their fathers only as distant figures who appeared occasionally between battles, the farmers whose fields had been trampled by armies, the merchants whose trade routes had been disrupted by constant warfare. The war had started famously because of Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, who had been taken from her Greek husband by Paris, a prince of Troy. But after 10 years of bloodshed, most people could barely remember what Helen looked like. The war had taken on a life of its own, becoming less about rescuing one woman and more about pride, honour, and the simple fact that neither side wanted to be the first to give up. Troy itself was a marvel of ancient engineering. The city sat on a hill overlooking the sea, surrounded by walls so high and thick that they seemed to scrape the bottom of the clouds. These weren't just any walls. They were said to have been built by the gods themselves, perfectly fitted stones rising so high that attackers on the ground looked like ants to defenders on the ramparts. For 10 years, the Greeks had camped on the beach below Troy, launching attack after attack against those impregnable walls. They had tried everything: siege engines, scaling ladders, tunnels, direct assaults, attempts to starve the city into submission. Nothing worked. Troy remained unconquered, its gates sealed, its people safe behind their god-built walls. That's when Odysseus had his idea. Odysseus was known throughout the Greek army as the most cunning warrior among them. Not the strongest. That was Achilles. Not the bravest. That honour went to Hector on the Trojan side. But when it came to creative problem solving, to finding solutions that no one else could see, Odysseus had no equal. He had been studying Troy's walls for months, walking the perimeter of their camp, staring up at the fortifications, thinking. The problem wasn't just that the walls were too high to climb or too thick to break. The problem was that the Trojans could see every attack coming from miles away. As long as they stayed behind their walls and kept the gates closed, they were essentially invulnerable. But what if, Odysseus wondered, the Trojans could be convinced to open the gates themselves? What if they could be tricked into bringing their enemies inside the city willingly? The plan he conceived was so audacious, so seemingly impossible, that when he first proposed it to the other Greek leaders, they thought he had lost his mind. Build a giant wooden horse, he said. Hide soldiers inside it. Leave it outside Troy's gates as an apparent offering to the gods, then sail away as if giving up the war. The Trojans, thinking they had won, would drag the horse inside their city as a trophy. And then, in the dead of night, the hidden soldiers would emerge and open Troy's gates from the inside. It will never work, said Menelaus, Helen's husband, who had started the war in the first place. The Trojans aren't stupid. They'll never fall for such an obvious trick. But Odysseus had thought of that too. The trick wasn't just the horse itself, it was the story that would accompany it. They would leave behind a single Greek soldier, someone who would claim to be a deserter, someone who would tell the Trojans exactly what they wanted to hear, that the Greeks had given up, that the horse was an offering to ensure safe passage home, that taking it into the city would guarantee Troy's protection by the gods. The construction of the horse took weeks. Greek carpenters who had spent 10 years building siege engines and repairing ships now found themselves crafting what was essentially the largest sculpture anyone had ever attempted. The horse had to be big enough to hide dozens of soldiers, but not so big that it couldn't be moved. It had to look impressive enough to seem like a genuine offering to the gods, but not so obviously hollow that the Trojans would immediately suspect a trick. Working mostly at night to keep their projects secret from Trojan scouts, the Greeks slowly assembled their masterpiece. The horse's body was built like a ship's hull, with hidden compartments and carefully concealed air holes. Its legs were thick enough to contain ladders. Its head was carved with intricate details that would convince anyone looking at it that this was a work of art, not a weapon of war. Meanwhile, Odysseus was selecting the soldiers who would hide inside. This wasn't a job for just anyone. The men chosen would have to remain perfectly still and silent for hours, maybe days, cramped in a dark, airless space, never knowing if they were about to be discovered. They would have to trust completely in Odysseus's plan, even when that plan required them to be carried helplessly into the heart of enemy territory. The night before the plan was set in motion, you could have walked through the Greek camp and seen something remarkable. An army that had been demoralized by 10 years of failure was suddenly energized by hope. Soldiers who had been going through the motions of war were now moving with purpose. They were either about to win the most famous victory in military history, or they were about to suffer the most humiliating defeat imaginable. At dawn, the Trojans on their walls witnessed something they had been dreaming of for a decade. The Greek ships sailing away. The entire fleet, hundreds of vessels that had dominated the coastline for 10 years, was disappearing over the horizon. The war, it seemed, was over. But there on the beach, where the Greek camp had stood, was something new. A massive wooden horse, more beautiful than anything the Trojans had ever seen. And sitting beside it, bound and apparently abandoned, was a single Greek soldier. When the Trojans brought this soldier inside their city for questioning, he told them exactly what Odysseus had coached him to say. His name was Sinon, and he had been left behind as a sacrifice to the gods, he claimed. The horse was an offering to Athena, built to ensure the Greeks' safe passage home, but the Greeks had made it huge on purpose, hoping the Trojans wouldn't be able to bring it inside their city, because if Troy possessed the horse, Athena's protection would transfer to them, making their city unconquerable forever. It was a masterful piece of reverse psychology. By claiming that the Greeks didn't want the Trojans to take the horse, Sinon made them desperate to have it. By suggesting that possessing it would bring divine protection, he appealed to their desire for security. By making it seem like taking the horse would be a way of getting revenge on their enemies, he turned Trojan pride into his greatest ally. The debate in Troy lasted hours. Some citizens argued for caution. After all, they had survived 10 years by being careful. Others pointed out that the war was clearly over, the Greeks were gone, and this beautiful horse would be a fitting trophy for their victory. A few suspicious voices suggested that the horse might be a trick, but they were shouted down by the majority who wanted to celebrate. In the end, celebration won over caution. The Trojans opened their gates, the same gates that had remained sealed for a decade, and brought the wooden horse inside their city. It took dozens of men and teams of oxen to move it, but they managed, dragging their doom through the streets while children cheered and adults threw flowers. That night, Troy celebrated as it hadn't celebrated in 10 years. There was wine and music and dancing in the streets. After a decade of siege, after 10 years of rationing and fear and uncertainty, the Trojans finally felt safe. The war was over, they had won, the Greeks were gone forever. And in the belly of the wooden horse, Odysseus and his chosen men waited in perfect silence. They waited through the sounds of celebration, through hours of singing and laughter and revelry. They waited until the sounds gradually died down, until the city fell into the deep sleep that comes after great joy and too much wine. They waited until Troy was more defenceless than it had been in 10 years. Then, in the darkest hour before dawn, Odysseus gave the signal. The hidden panels in the horse's belly opened silently. Ropes dropped down, and one by one the Greek soldiers descended into the sleeping city. They moved like shadows through streets they had been studying from a distance for a decade, making their way toward Troy's gates. The guards at the gates, exhausted from a night of celebration, never saw them coming. Within minutes, the massive bars that had protected Troy for 10 years were being lifted. The gates that had remained closed through every Greek assault were swinging open from the inside, and there, waiting just offshore where Trojan lookouts couldn't see them, was the entire Greek fleet. They hadn't sailed home at all. They had only sailed out of sight, waiting for Odysseus' signal, fires lit on Troy's walls by the soldiers from the wooden horse. By the time most Trojans realised what was happening, their city was full of Greek soldiers. The war that had lasted 10 years ended in a single night, brought to a close not by strength or courage, but by cleverness and the very human tendency to believe what we want to believe. Troy fell, and with it ended one of the most famous stories in all of literature. But the wooden horse lived on in memory and legend, becoming a symbol of how intelligence can triumph over strength, how a small deception can bring down the mightiest fortress, how sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones we invite inside ourselves. Tonight, as you consider this ancient story, you might think about the gates we all keep, the defences we build around our hearts, our hopes, our dreams. And you might wonder, what wooden horses are we sometimes tempted to drag inside our own walls? What gifts that seem too good to be true might actually be exactly that? Sometimes the most important battles are won not by the strongest warriors, but by those who understand that the mind is the most powerful weapon of all. Sometimes the most devastating defeats come not from wooden horses or conquered cities, but from the simple failure to communicate at the right moment. From Troy's fallen walls, we turn to another kind of barrier, one built not by gods or kings, but by families who couldn't see past their own pride to the love blooming in their children's hearts. In the ancient city of Babylon, two houses stood side by side so close that their walls actually touched. If you had walked down that street on any ordinary day, you might have noticed how different these two homes were. One was painted blue and decorated with intricate tile work. The other was painted white with geometric patterns around the windows. Even their architecture seemed to argue with each other, and argue they did. The families who lived in these houses, parents, grandparents, cousins, and extended relations, had been feuding for so long that no one could quite remember how it started. Maybe it was a business deal gone wrong, or a marriage proposal that was refused, or simply the accumulated irritation of living too close to people you didn't particularly like. Whatever the original cause, the hatred had grown over the years like a poisonous plant. fed by small slights and imagined insults until it had taken on a life of its own. In the blue house lived a boy named Pyramus. He was the kind of young man who had never quite learned to hide his feelings. When he was happy, his whole face lit up, and when he was sad, you could see it in the way he carried his shoulders. His parents loved him dearly, but they had raised him to believe that the family in the White House next door were their enemies, people to be avoided and distrusted. In the White House lived a girl named Thisbe, and if you could have seen her, you would have understood immediately why the story of Romeo and Juliet, written centuries later, would echo this ancient tale. Thisbe had the kind of beauty that wasn't just physical. She was beautiful in the way she listened when people spoke, in the way she moved through the world with gentle curiosity, in the way she could find something interesting in the most ordinary conversation. For years, Pyramus and Thisbe grew up on opposite sides of that shared wall, forbidden by their families from so much as speaking to each other. They would glimpse each other sometimes in the marketplace or at religious festivals, but always surrounded by watchful relatives who made sure no contact was possible. But here's the thing about walls. They're built to keep people apart, but sometimes they end up bringing people together in unexpected ways. The wall between the two houses was old, built of brick and mortar that had settled and shifted over the years. Somewhere near the ground, probably where the foundation had shifted during a particularly wet season, a small crack had appeared. Not big enough for anyone to notice unless they were looking for it, not wide enough for anything larger than a whispered word to pass through. Pyramus discovered the crack first. He had been in his family's garden, probably trying to avoid another lecture about the evils of the neighbours, when he heard something that made him stop and listen. Someone crying, very softly on the other side of the wall. Without thinking about family loyalty or ancient feuds, Pyramus did what any kind person would do. He knelt down beside the wall and whispered, "Are you all right?" The crying stopped immediately. For a long moment there was complete silence. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, came a reply, "Who's there?" And that was how it began. Not with grand romantic gestures or dramatic declarations, but with one person asking if another person was okay. Over the following weeks, Pyramus and Thisbe began meeting at the crack in the wall. They couldn't see each other, could barely hear each other. Somehow that made their conversations more intimate rather than less. Without the distraction of physical appearance or body language, they talked about everything. Their dreams, their fears, their thoughts about life and love and the strange situation that kept them apart. Thisbe told Pyramus about her love of astronomy, how she would sneak up to her roof at night to watch the stars and imagine what it would be like to travel among them. Pyramus told Thisbe about his passion for poetry, how he would write verses about everything he saw and felt, verses he could never share with anyone else because his family considered poetry a waste of time. They began to know each other in ways that people who see each other every day sometimes never do. They learned the sound of each other's laughter, the rhythm of each other's breathing, the particular way each of them sighed when thinking about something sad or difficult. And inevitably, they fell in love. Not the sudden, overwhelming passion of gods and heroes, but the slow, deep love that grows between people who truly understand each other. They loved each other's minds first, then their hearts, and finally, though they had never touched, they loved each other completely. But loving someone through a crack in a wall, no matter how deep that love might be, eventually becomes a kind of beautiful torture. They wanted to hold hands, to look into each other's eyes, to simply exist in the same space without barriers between them. That's when they decided to meet in person. The plan they made was simple but dangerous. They would sneak out of their houses at midnight and meet at a tomb outside the city, a place where no one would think to look for them, where they could finally see each other face to face. The tomb they chose was beneath a mulberry tree famous for its white berries, beside a spring where the water was said to be particularly sweet. Thisbe, perhaps because she had been more confined by her family's watchfulness, arrived first. Picture her there in the moonlight, a young woman who had spent months falling in love, with a voice and a heart, finally about to meet the person who had become the centre of her world. She sat beneath the mulberry tree, probably nervous but happy, listening for Pyramus's footsteps on the path. The night was warm and still, the kind of night when every sound carries further than usual, when even whispers seem to echo. But instead of her beloved's footsteps, Thisbe heard something else. The heavy padding of large paws, the low rumble of a predator's growl. A lion was approaching the spring to drink, and its mouth was stained with blood from a recent kill. Thisbe did what any sensible person would do. She ran. In her haste to escape, she dropped her cloak, the beautiful white cloak she had worn to look her best for Pyramus. The lion, more interested in drinking than in chasing prey, sniffed the cloak briefly, leaving bloody paw prints on the white fabric before continuing to the spring. When Pyramus arrived a few minutes later, he found Thisbe's blood-stained cloak lying torn beneath the mulberry tree. In the moonlight, with his heart already racing from the secret adventure and the anticipation of finally seeing his love, he saw exactly what anyone would see, evidence of a terrible tragedy. The love of his life was dead, killed by wild animals while waiting for him. If he had been on time, if he had been braver, if he had convinced her to choose a safer meeting place, she would still be alive. The guilt and grief hit him like a physical blow, dropping him to his knees beside her bloodied cloak. Without hesitation, without pausing to consider other possibilities, Pyramus drew his sword and drove it into his own heart. Love and grief had combined into something that made life without Thisbe seem impossible. His blood spilled onto the white mulberry berries above him, staining them deep red. When Thisbe finally crept back to the meeting place, the lion long gone, her fear overcome by worry for Pyramus, she found a scene that must have seemed like the end of the world. Her beloved lying still beneath the tree, her own cloak beside him covered in what she assumed was his blood, the white mulberry berries now stained red as garnets. She understood immediately what had happened. Pyramus had found her cloak, assumed she was dead, and killed himself rather than live without her. The boy who had spent months whispering words of love through a crack in a wall had chosen to follow her into death rather than face life alone. And Thisbe, looking at his still face in the moonlight, made the same choice. She picked up his sword, still warm from his blood, and whispered one last time the words she had been saying through the wall for months. "I love you." Then she drove the blade into her own heart, falling beside him beneath the mulberry tree. Their families found them the next morning, and the sight of their dead children finally broke through the hatred that had divided them for so long. Looking at Pyramus and Thisbe lying together in death, their parents realised that their ancient feud had cost them the two people they loved most in the world. The families buried the young lovers together in a single tomb, their ashes mingled so they could never be separated again. And the mulberry tree above them, they decreed, would forever bear red berries instead of white, a memorial to the blood that had been spilled beneath its branches for love. But perhaps the real memorial to Pyramus and Thisbe is the question their story leaves us with. How many walls do we build in our own lives? How many barriers do we maintain between ourselves and the people we could love if we just found the courage to look past old hurts and ancient grievances? Their love began with someone asking, "Are you all right?" through a crack in a wall. It grew through months of patient conversation, of learning to know each other without the distractions of physical presence. It was a love built on understanding, on shared dreams and gentle care for each other's feelings. And it ended because, in the crucial moment when communication mattered most, they couldn't reach each other. If Thisbe had been able to tell Pyramus that she was safe, if Pyramus had waited long enough to hear her explanation, if either of them had paused to consider that things might not be exactly as they appeared, the story would have ended differently. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you might think about the walls in your own life, and the small cracks where love might find a way through. You might consider the importance of patient listening, of asking, "Are you all right?" when someone seems troubled, of remembering that sometimes the most important conversations happen in whispers. And maybe you'll remember that the best love stories aren't always the ones with happy endings, but the ones that remind us how precious and fragile connection really is, and how much courage it takes to keep reaching toward each other across whatever barriers stand in our way. Love can be lost through misunderstanding, but sometimes understanding itself becomes the most dangerous game of all. From the tragedy of lovers separated by walls and silence, we turn to a story about a different kind of barrier, one made not of stone or family feuds, but of words themselves, twisted into puzzles that could mean the difference between life and death. Outside the city of Thebes, on a rocky outcrop that overlooked the main road, there lived a creature unlike any other in Greek mythology. The Sphinx had the body of a lion, the wings of an eagle, and the head and torso of a woman. But it wasn't her unusual appearance that made travellers fear her. It was her voice, and the deadly game she insisted on playing with everyone who passed by. The Sphinx had been sent to Thebes by the gods as a punishment. though the people of the city couldn't understand what they had done to deserve such a fate. For months, she had been stopping every traveller who tried to enter or leave the city, challenging them to solve a riddle. Those who answered correctly were allowed to pass. Those who answered incorrectly were killed immediately, their bodies left as a warning to others, and no one, not scholars, not priests, not the wisest elders in all of Greece, had ever answered correctly. The riddle itself was famous throughout the ancient world. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? Simple words, but somehow no one could puzzle out their meaning. The Sphinx would perch on her rock, her great wings folded around her like a cloak, and speak these words in a voice that was both beautiful and terrifying. The people of Thebes were effectively trapped in their own city. Trade had stopped because merchants were too afraid to risk the journey. Families were separated because no one dared travel the roads. The city was slowly strangling under the Sphinx's reign of terror, and their king, Laius, seemed powerless to stop it. That's when Oedipus arrived. Now, Oedipus had his own complicated story, one involving prophecies and terrible misunderstandings that would eventually become one of the most famous tragedies in all of literature. But at this moment in his life, he was simply a young man travelling toward Thebes, unaware of the Sphinx's challenge, unaware that he was walking into what everyone else considered certain death. He had been walking for days, and the sun was high and hot when he first saw the rocky outcrop ahead. Something large was perched there. At first he thought it might be a boulder or a dead tree, but as he got closer, he realised it was alive and watching him. The Sphinx waited until Oedipus was close enough to hear her clearly, then spread her great wings and spoke in a voice that seemed to come from the rocks themselves. "Traveller, you may not pass until you answer my riddle. Answer correctly, and you may continue on your way. Answer incorrectly, and you will die where you stand." Oedipus looked up at this impossible creature, part woman, part lion, part bird, and felt something most people in this situation would have felt, curiosity rather than fear. Here was a puzzle, and Oedipus had always loved puzzles. Where others saw danger, he saw an interesting challenge. "Very well," he said, settling down on a rock as if he had all the time in the world. "Ask your riddle." The Sphinx's eyes glittered with what might have been amusement. This young man was either very brave or very foolish, and either way, he would soon be dead like all the others. She posed the riddle that had stumped every scholar in Greece. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? Oedipus listened carefully, then sat quietly for a long moment, chin in his hand, thinking. The Sphinx watched him with the patience of a predator, probably already imagining how she would kill him when he gave the inevitable wrong answer. But Oedipus was thinking not about magical creatures or mythical beasts, but about something much more ordinary and close to home. He was thinking about his own life, about the lives of everyone he had ever known, about the simple progression that every human being follows from birth to death. Finally, he looked up at the Sphinx and smiled. "The answer is man," he said calmly. "A human being crawls on 4 legs as a baby in the morning of life, walks on 2 legs as an adult at the noon of life, and uses a walking stick, 3 legs, in the evening of old age." The silence that followed was unlike any silence the road to Thebes had ever heard. The Sphinx stared down at Oedipus with an expression of pure shock. For months she had watched the greatest minds in Greece struggle with her riddle, had seen them guess everything from exotic animals to supernatural beings to complex philosophical concepts. And this young man had solved it by thinking about the most basic, obvious thing in the world, the simple progression of human life. But the Sphinx's shock quickly turned to something else. Rage. Her entire purpose, her reason for existing, had been to pose this riddle that no one could solve. The gods had sent her to punish Thebes by making the roads impassable, and now this stranger had undone months of work with a single, simple answer. According to some versions of the story, the Sphinx threw herself from her rocky perch in despair, dying rather than facing the humiliation of defeat. According to others, she simply vanished, her purpose fulfilled and her power broken. But all versions agree on one thing. The roads to Thebes were open again, and Oedipus had accomplished something that the wisest people in Greece had failed to do. When Oedipus arrived in Thebes, he was greeted as a hero. The people lined the streets to cheer the man who had freed them from the Sphinx's terror. King Laius had recently died under mysterious circumstances, and the grateful citizens offered to make Oedipus their new king. They even offered him the hand of the widowed queen Jocasta in marriage. Oedipus accepted both honours, thinking himself the luckiest man alive. He had solved an impossible riddle, saved a city, become a king, and married a beautiful queen. What more could anyone ask for? But here's the terrible irony that the ancient Greeks understood so well. Sometimes getting everything you think you want is the beginning of your worst nightmare. Oedipus had no way of knowing that his victory over the Sphinx was only the first chapter in a story that would become one of the most heartbreaking tales ever told. You see, the riddle that Oedipus solved so easily, about the stages of human life, would become a cruel metaphor for his own existence. He had answered correctly about mankind's journey from crawling infant to walking adult to elderly person with a cane. But he hadn't yet learned that some journeys lead us to places we never wanted to go. The Sphinx's defeat meant that the roads were open, that families could reunite, that merchants could resume their trade. The city of Thebes celebrated for days, and Oedipus found himself at the centre of it all, the hero who had freed them with nothing more than cleverness and courage. But as you lie here tonight, settling into sleep, maybe you'll think about the Sphinx's riddle differently than Oedipus did. Maybe you'll realise that she wasn't just asking about the mechanics of ageing, but about something deeper. The way we all begin helpless, spend our middle years trying to stand on our own 2 feet, and often end up needing support again. The Sphinx represented the mystery of existence itself, the questions that have no easy answers, the puzzles that can't be solved with simple logic. Oedipus defeated her by thinking literally, practically, obviously. But life, as he would soon discover, is rarely that straightforward. Sometimes the most dangerous riddles aren't the ones creatures pose to us on rocky outcrops. They're the ones we pose to ourselves. Who am I? Where do I belong? What do I really want? And sometimes the answers we think we've found turn out to be only the beginning of much harder questions. Tonight, as the Sphinx's ancient riddle echoes in your dreams, you might find yourself wondering, what puzzles are you still trying to solve? What questions keep you awake at night? And maybe, just maybe, you'll discover that the most important answers aren't the ones that defeat monsters, but the ones that help us understand ourselves. There's something haunting about riddles that seem simple on the surface but hide deeper truths beneath. And speaking of hidden depths, our next story takes us to a pool of water so clear and still that it becomes a window into one of the most beautiful and tragic tales in all of Greek mythology. Narcissus was born beautiful, not just handsome, not just attractive, but beautiful in a way that made people stop whatever they were doing and stare. When he walked through the market, conversations would halt mid-sentence. When he passed by groups of young women, they would whisper among themselves for hours afterward. Even elderly people, who had seen many beautiful faces in their time, would shake their heads in wonder at the sight of him. His beauty wasn't just physical, though. That was certainly striking enough. He had dark hair that caught the light like silk, eyes the colour of deep forest pools, skin smooth as polished marble. But there was something else about him, a quality that seemed to glow from within, as if he had been touched by the gods themselves, which as it turned out he had been. Narcissus was the son of a river god and a nymph, which explained his otherworldly beauty. But it also explained something else about him. He had never learned to love anyone but himself. Not because he was cruel or selfish in the usual sense, but because no one had ever seemed real enough, substantial enough, worthy enough to capture his attention. As Narcissus grew from a beautiful child into a beautiful young man, many people tried to win his affection. Young women would bring him gifts, flowers they had picked, songs they had composed, poems they had written in his honour. Young men would challenge him to competitions, hoping to impress him with their strength or skill. Older people would invite him to their homes, hoping to bask in his presence. But Narcissus remained untouched by all of it. He would accept the gifts with polite disinterest, ignore the competitions, decline the invitations. Not rudely, but with the kind of distant courtesy you might show to strangers whose language you don't speak. The most persistent of his admirers was a nymph named Echo, and her story is heartbreaking in its own right. Echo had once been a chatterbox, famous throughout the countryside for her ability to tell stories that could make you laugh until your sides hurt or cry until your heart broke. But she'd made the mistake of distracting the goddess Hera with her tales, while Zeus was having affairs, and Hera's punishment was swift and cruel. Echo could no longer speak her own words. She could only repeat the last words that others spoke to her. Imagine trying to express love, affection, or even basic friendship when you can only echo what others say. Echo followed Narcissus through the forests, hiding behind trees, listening to his voice and repeating his words back to him in the hope that somehow he would understand what she was trying to communicate. One day, Narcissus was walking alone through a particularly dense part of the woods when he heard footsteps following him. "Who's there?" he called out, and immediately heard his words called back. "Who's there?" "Come out, let me see you," he said, and the voice replied, "Let me see you." When Echo finally emerged from behind the trees, Narcissus saw a lovely nymph with desperate hope in her eyes, reaching out her arms toward him. But instead of being moved by her obvious devotion, instead of being curious about her strange way of speaking, Narcissus felt nothing but mild annoyance. "Leave me alone," he said harshly. "I would rather die than give you power over me." Echo could only repeat his cruel words, "Give you power over me." But she understood their meaning, and the rejection hit her like a physical blow. She fled deeper into the forest, where she pined away until nothing was left of her but her voice, forever repeating the words of others, forever unable to speak her own truth. This scene was witnessed by Nemesis, the goddess of revenge, who had been watching Narcissus for some time with growing concern. Nemesis wasn't interested in petty revenge. She was concerned with cosmic justice, with making sure that people who abused their gifts received appropriate consequences, and Narcissus, Nemesis decided, was long overdue for a lesson in humility. The curse Nemesis placed on Narcissus was elegant in its simplicity. He would fall in love, deeply and completely, with someone who could never love him back, someone who would always be just out of reach, no matter how desperately he yearned for them. It happened on one of those perfect spring days when the air is soft and warm, and every flower seems to be blooming at once. Narcissus had been hunting in the forest, not because he needed food, but because he enjoyed the solitude, the challenge, the feeling of moving through the trees like a graceful shadow. As the afternoon grew hot, he came upon a pool unlike any he had ever seen. The water was so clear it looked like liquid crystal, so still it might have been polished glass. Ancient trees surrounded it, their branches forming a natural canopy that filtered the sunlight into soft, dancing patterns on the water's surface. Narcissus knelt by the edge of the pool to drink, and that's when he saw him. The most beautiful young man he had ever laid eyes on was looking up at him from the depths of the water. The stranger had dark hair that seemed to move like silk in an invisible breeze, eyes like forest pools, skin that glowed with inner light. When Narcissus moved, the beautiful stranger moved too. When Narcissus smiled, the stranger smiled back with a smile that could have lit up the darkest night. For the first time in his life, Narcissus felt his heart race with something beyond casual interest. This was what love was supposed to feel like, this overwhelming desire to know everything about another person, to spend every moment in their presence, to somehow become worthy of their affection. He reached out to touch the beautiful stranger's face, but his fingers only met the cool surface of the water, causing ripples that made the image waver and disappear. Frantically, Narcissus waited for the water to still again, and when it did, there was the stranger, looking up at him with what seemed like equal longing. "Who are you?" Narcissus whispered to the water. The stranger's lips moved as if speaking, but no sound emerged. "Can you hear me? Do you feel what I feel?" Days passed. Narcissus refused to leave the pool, afraid that if he went away, the beautiful stranger might disappear forever. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped caring about anything except the face in the water that seemed to understand him completely, but remained forever beyond his reach. Friends came looking for him and found him lying by the pool, growing thinner and paler by the day, talking to his own reflection with the desperate intensity of a man trying to solve the riddle of existence itself. "This is madness," they told him. "Come away from here. There are people who care about you, people who want to help you." But Narcissus couldn't hear them anymore. He was lost in the eyes of the stranger in the water, a stranger who seemed to be reaching up toward him with the same desperate longing he felt reaching down. It was Echo who finally understood what was happening. She had been watching from the shadows, her heart breaking for the young man who had rejected her so cruelly, but whom she still loved. When she realized that Narcissus was pining away for his own reflection, she felt a mixture of sorrow, justice, and profound sadness for the beautiful fool who had finally learned what it meant to love without hope. "He is me," Narcissus whispered to the water one day, and Echo repeated from the trees, He is me. The truth of it hit him like a thunderbolt. The stranger he had fallen in love with, the perfect companion he had been seeking all his life, was himself. But knowing the truth didn't free him from the curse. If anything, it made his situation more tragic. How do you stop loving someone who is you but not you, who understands you perfectly but can never actually touch you, who mirrors your every emotion but can never speak words of comfort or love? Narcissus lay by the pool until his beauty faded, until his body became too weak to support life, until there was nothing left of him but his voice calling to the stranger in the water, and Echo's voice calling back from the trees. When he finally died, the gods took pity on him and transformed his body into a flower, a delicate white bloom with a golden centre that grows near pools and streams, forever bending toward the water as if searching for something just beneath the surface. The story of Narcissus has been told for thousands of years, and it's been interpreted in countless ways. Some see it as a warning about vanity, others as a tale about the impossibility of self-love. But maybe, as you drift towards sleep tonight, you'll think about it differently. Maybe you'll realise that Narcissus's real tragedy wasn't that he loved himself, but that he had never learned to love anyone else. He had been so isolated by his own beauty, so cut off from genuine human connection, that when he finally felt the stirring of the love, the only person available to receive it was himself. And maybe you'll think about the pools in your own life, the moments when you catch glimpses of who you really are, who you could become, who you've always been beneath the surface. The question isn't whether those glimpses are real or reflection, but whether you can find ways to love what you see without becoming lost in it. Tonight, as narcissus flowers bloom by pools around the world, they remind us that the most beautiful love stories aren't always the ones with happy endings, but the ones that teach us something about the mysterious, complicated, wonderful challenge of being human. Sometimes we fall in love with reflections that can never love us back, but other times, love itself becomes the reason we make choices that change the world forever. From the pool where Narcissus discovered the impossible nature of loving oneself, we turn now to a story about a different kind of love, the love between husband and wife, and how that love led to the most famous act of curiosity in all of mythology. Before we meet Pandora, we need to understand that the world was a very different place then. This was back when humans were still new to the earth, still learning how to build fires and grow crops and make tools from stone and wood. It was a time when people rarely got sick, when they didn't age the way we do now, when death was something that happened rarely and usually only by accident. It sounds like paradise, doesn't it? But here's the strange thing about that early world. People weren't particularly happy. They had everything they needed to survive, but they lived their days without much joy, without passion, without the deep connections that make life worth living. They existed, but they didn't really live. The gods had created humans as an experiment, really. They wanted beings who could appreciate the beauty of the world, who could build things and create art and tell stories. But they also wanted to make sure that humans never became too powerful, never forgot that they were mortal creatures dependent on divine goodwill. Everything changed when Prometheus decided to steal fire from the gods and give it to humanity. Now Prometheus was a titan, one of the older gods who had been around since before Zeus and his siblings took control of the universe. He had always felt a special affection for humans. He had even helped create them, shaping their bodies from clay and breathing life into their lungs. When he saw how grey and lifeless human existence had become, he made a decision that would change everything. Fire in the ancient world wasn't just about warmth and light. Fire represented knowledge, creativity, the spark of inspiration that separates mere existence from truly living. When Prometheus gave fire to humans, he wasn't just giving them a tool, he was giving them the ability to reach towards something greater than themselves. Zeus was furious. The king of the gods had very specific ideas about the balance of power between mortals and immortals, and Prometheus had upset that balance in a way that could never be undone. Humans with fire were humans with possibilities, and Zeus wasn't sure he liked where those possibilities might lead. So Zeus devised a punishment that was both revenge against Prometheus and a way to limit humanity's new potential. He ordered the other gods to create a woman unlike any who had ever existed before. Each god contributed something to her creation. Athena gave her wisdom and skill with her hands. Aphrodite gave her beauty that would make men forget their own names. Apollo gave her musical talent. Hermes gave her a voice like honey and the ability to speak many languages. Hera gave her curiosity. deep, unquenchable curiosity about everything in the world. They called her Pandora, which means all gifts, because she had received something from every god. But the most important gift came from Zeus himself, though it wasn't really a gift at all. It was a large clay jar sealed with wax and bound with golden cords, and strict instructions never, ever to open it. This jar contains things that are not meant for human eyes, Zeus told her. No matter how curious you become, no matter how much you wonder what's inside, you must never break the seal. Do you understand? Pandora nodded, though even as she made the promise, she could feel Hera's gift of curiosity stirring in her mind like a small restless animal. Zeus sent Pandora to Earth as a bride for Epimetheus, Prometheus's brother. If Prometheus was known for thinking ahead, Epimetheus was famous for acting first and considering consequences later. When he saw Pandora standing at his door, beautiful, intelligent, and talented, everything he had ever dreamed of in a companion, he invited her in without thinking to ask why the gods would suddenly send him such a wonderful gift. For a while, their life together was everything a marriage should be. Pandora was fascinated by human customs, by the way mortals lived and worked and loved. She learned to cook and garden, to weave and sing, and to tell stories by the fire in the evening. Epimetheus, meanwhile, felt like the luckiest man alive. He had a wife who was beautiful and wise, who laughed at his jokes and listened to his thoughts, who made every ordinary day feel like an adventure. But there was one small problem: the jar. Pandora had placed it in the back corner of their home, behind baskets of grain and bundles of wool, where she wouldn't have to look at it every day, but she always knew it was there. In quiet moments, when she was grinding grain or mending clothes, her mind would wander to that sealed jar and wonder what Zeus had hidden inside. Maybe it was treasure, she thought. Maybe the jar was full of gold coins or precious gems, and Zeus had simply wanted to test her honesty. Maybe it contained magical items, a cloak that could make her invisible, or shoes that would let her fly, or a mirror that could show the future. Or maybe it contained something dangerous. Maybe that's why Zeus had been so stern about keeping it sealed. Maybe inside the jar were monsters or poisons or curses that could destroy the world. The more Pandora tried not to think about the jar, the more she thought about it. The more she tried to ignore its presence in her home, the more aware of it she became. It was like having a word on the tip of your tongue that you can't quite remember, or an itch in a place you can't quite reach. Epimetheus noticed his wife's distraction, of course. In the evenings, when they would usually talk and laugh together, he would catch her staring off into space with a distant expression. During the day, he would sometimes find her standing in the back corner of their home, looking at something he couldn't see. "What's troubling you?" he asked one evening. "You seem so far away lately." Pandora almost told him about the jar then. She almost described the gift Zeus had given her, the promise she had made, the curiosity that was growing stronger every day like a plant that had taken root in her mind. But something stopped her. Maybe the memory of Zeus's stern warning, maybe simple embarrassment that she was struggling with something that should have been easy. "It's nothing," she said, and smiled in a way that was supposed to be reassuring but only made Epimetheus more worried. The crisis came on a day when Epimetheus had gone to visit his brother. Prometheus had been chained to a rock as punishment for stealing fire, and Epimetheus tried to visit him whenever Zeus's eagles went tearing out his liver. It was a long journey, one that would keep him away from home for several days. Pandora kissed her husband goodbye that morning, watched him disappear down the path that led away from their home, and then found herself alone with her thoughts for the first time in months. She tried to keep busy. She tended her garden, wove new cloth, prepared meals she would eat by herself. But without Epimetheus there to talk to, without the comfortable distraction of his presence, the jar seemed to call to her more loudly than ever. By the third day of his absence, Pandora could think of nothing else. She would lie awake at night, listening to the wind in the trees and wondering what sounds might come from the jar if she were to break the seal. She would sit by her loom during the day, her hands working automatically while her mind spun theories about what Zeus might have hidden from human eyes. "Just a little look," she whispered to herself on the fourth morning. "Just enough to satisfy my curiosity. I don't have to open it all the way. Just enough to peek inside." She found herself standing in front of the jar before she had consciously decided to move. It was smaller than she remembered, just a simple clay vessel that could have held olive oil or wine. The golden cords that bound it were beautiful but not particularly strong. The wax seal looked old and brittle. Just a tiny opening, Pandora murmured, and her fingers began working at the cords almost without her permission. Just enough to see what's inside. Then I'll seal it right back up and no one will ever know. The cords came loose more easily than she had expected. The wax seal cracked at her touch, and before she quite realised what she was doing, Pandora had lifted the lid of the jar and looked inside. What came out wasn't treasure or magic items or even monsters in any recognisable form. Instead, the air filled with things that had no shape but were somehow visible anyway. Dark, writhing things that moved like smoke but felt solid as they brushed past her face. Disease flew out of the jar first, followed by old age, creeping and grey. Then came sorrow, wrapping itself around Pandora's heart like cold fingers. Jealousy slithered past her feet. Hatred spread its dark wings and soared toward the open door. Fear scuttled into corners like a spider seeking darkness. Pandora tried to close the jar, but it was too late. All of Zeus's carefully contained evils were pouring into the world, carried on invisible wings to every corner of the earth where humans lived and loved and worked. Within hours, people who had never known illness would fall sick. Within days, those who had lived for centuries without aging would see their first grey hairs, their first wrinkles. But just as Pandora was about to give up, just as she was about to let the last of the jar's contents escape into the world, she heard something that made her stop. A small voice, soft and musical, calling from the very bottom of the jar. "Wait," the voice said. "Don't close the lid yet, let me out too." Pandora peered into the jar and saw a tiny figure with gossamer wings glowing like a firefly. "Who are you?" she whispered. "I am Hope," the small creature replied. "Zeus put me in the jar with all the evils, but I am not evil. I am the thing that helps humans endure everything else that has escaped. Please, let me out so I can do my work." And so Pandora opened the jar one last time, just wide enough for Hope to flutter out and join the other forces now loose in the world. When Epimetheus returned from visiting his brother, he found his wife sitting by the empty jar, tears streaming down her face. The world around them had already begun to change. Flowers were wilting in the garden, shadows seemed darker, and there was a heaviness in the air that hadn't been there before. Pandora told him everything, about the jar, about Zeus's warning, about her curiosity and her terrible mistake. She expected anger, recriminations, blame. Instead, Epimetheus sat down beside her and took her hand. "What's done is done," he said quietly. "We'll face whatever comes next together." And they did. As disease and old age and sorrow spread through the world, as humans learned for the first time what it meant to suffer and lose and grieve, Pandora and Epimetheus discovered something unexpected. These new hardships made their love deeper, not shallower. When Epimetheus fell ill, Pandora's care for him was more tender than anything they had shared in their easier days. When Pandora aged, Epimetheus found her more beautiful than ever. Hope too did her work. In the darkest moments, when despair seemed overwhelming, Hope would flutter near with her gentle light, reminding people that no matter how bad things got, they would not always be that way, that love could survive loss, that joy could return after sorrow, that every ending was also a kind of beginning. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, you might think about Pandora's jar and the choice she made on that long ago morning. Was it really a mistake, or was it necessary? Would the world be better if humans had never learned to suffer, or do our struggles give life meaning that simple happiness cannot provide? And maybe you'll think about Hope, still fluttering around the world, still doing her quiet work of helping us endure whatever troubles escape from the jars we cannot help but open. Sometimes the most important gifts are the ones that come after we think we've lost everything else. After Pandora opened her jar and released both suffering and hope into the world, we come now to our final story, one that begins with the greatest war ever fought and ends with the most enduring punishment ever given. It's the story of a titan who learned that some burdens once accepted become part of who you are forever. Long before Zeus ruled the heavens, before the familiar gods of Mount Olympus were even born, the world was governed by an older generation of immortals called the Titans. These were beings of immense power and size, children of the earth and sky themselves, who had ruled for countless ages in a time when everything was larger, stranger, more primeval than the world we know. Atlas was one of these titans, and in many ways he was the most magnificent of them all. Picture him as he was in those days, a giant among giants, tall enough that his head brushed against the clouds, strong enough to move mountains with his bare hands. His voice, when he spoke, was like distant thunder. His footsteps could shake the earth for miles around. But Atlas wasn't just impressive because of his size. He had a mind that could grasp the movements of stars, the patterns of weather, the deep currents that flowed through both ocean and the sky. While other titans concerned themselves with immediate pleasures or petty squabbles, Atlas studied the great systems that kept the world in balance. He was fascinated by the way the heavens moved above the earth, how the sun traced its daily path from east to west, how the moon waxed and waned in predictable cycles, how the stars wheeled through their ancient patterns. In those days, the sky was held up by vast pillars that stretched from the earth to the celestial dome, and Atlas made it his business to understand how those pillars worked, how they could be maintained, how they kept everything from collapsing into chaos. This knowledge made Atlas invaluable to his fellow Titans, but it also made him proud. He began to believe that he understood the workings of the universe better than anyone else, even better than Cronus, the king of the Titans. And when Zeus and his siblings began their rebellion against the old order, Atlas made a choice that would define the rest of his existence. The war between the Titans and the younger gods lasted for 10 years, and it was unlike any conflict the world had ever seen. Mountains were thrown like stones, seas boiled. The very foundations of reality shook under the assault of divine powers, unleashed without restraint. Atlas fought on the side of the Titans, not just because they were his family, but because he genuinely believed they were better suited to rule the universe. The younger gods, he thought, were impulsive and emotional. They made decisions based on passion rather than wisdom, on personal desire rather than cosmic balance. He was, in many ways, correct. Zeus and his siblings were indeed more emotional, more unpredictable than the ancient Titans, but Atlas failed to understand that sometimes the universe needs a little chaos, a little unpredictability to keep it from becoming stagnant. When the war finally ended with Zeus's victory, most of the defeated Titans were imprisoned in Tartarus, the deepest, darkest prison in existence. But Zeus had a different punishment in mind for Atlas, one that was both more terrible and more fitting than simple imprisonment. "You think you understand the workings of the heavens better than anyone else," Zeus said to the defeated Titan. "Very well, you will hold up the sky itself forever. Let's see how well your knowledge serves you when you're carrying the weight of the entire celestial sphere on your shoulders." And so, Atlas found himself condemned to stand at the western edge of the world, where the sun sets each evening, holding up the sky so that it wouldn't crash down onto the earth below. The ancient pillars that had supported the heavens were removed, and their function was transferred to Atlas himself. At first, Atlas thought he could handle it. He was strong after all, stronger than any creature that had ever lived. How hard could it be to hold up the sky? But the sky, he discovered, wasn't just heavy, it was infinite. Every star, every planet, every wisp of cloud was pressing down on his shoulders. The weight wasn't just physical, it was metaphysical, spiritual, the crushing burden of all space and time above the earth. Days passed, then months, then years. Atlas's back began to ache in ways he had never imagined possible. His shoulders felt like they were on fire. His legs trembled under the impossible load. But he couldn't rest, couldn't shift the burden to someone else, couldn't even adjust his position without risking the collapse of everything above. Decades turned into centuries, centuries into millennia. Atlas watched the rise and fall of civilizations from his position at the edge of the world. He saw humans discover fire, build cities, develop art and literature and philosophy. He watched them make the same mistakes over and over again. Watched them struggle with the gifts and curses that had escaped from Pandora's jar. Sometimes, heroes would come to visit him. They had heard stories about the Titan who held up the sky, and they wanted to see this wonder for themselves. Most of them came expecting to find a monster, but instead they found something much more complex. A being who'd been transformed by his punishment into something both more and less than he had been before. The most famous of these visitors was Heracles, the greatest hero of the ancient world, who came to Atlas seeking help with one of his 12 labours. Heracles needed to obtain the golden apples that grew in the garden of the Hesperides, Atlas's daughters, and he thought the Titan might be willing to retrieve them in exchange for a brief respite from his burden. "I'll hold up the sky while you're gone," Heracles offered. "Just for a little while, you can get the apples, and be back before nightfall." Atlas looked at the young hero with something like amusement. "Do you have any idea what you're offering?" he asked. "Do you understand what this burden really means?" But Heracles was confident in his strength, and Atlas, after centuries of carrying the sky alone, was desperate for even a moment's relief. So they made the exchange. Heracles took the sky on his shoulders, and Atlas set off to retrieve the golden apples. For the first time in ages, beyond counting, Atlas felt the weight lifted from his shoulders. He stretched, rolled his neck, flexed his fingers. The freedom was so intoxicating that for a moment he considered never returning, leaving Heracles to carry the burden forever. But when Atlas returned with the apples and saw Heracles struggling under the weight of the sky, this hero who had slain monsters and completed impossible tasks now trembling like a leaf under the cosmic burden, he realized something important about his punishment. It wasn't just about holding up the sky, it was about bearing witness to the world below, about understanding the full weight of existence, about becoming something larger than himself through constant service to something even larger. Atlas took the sky back onto his shoulders, not because Zeus forced him to, but because he had learned that this was his role in the universe. He had become the guardian of the boundary between earth and heaven, the keeper of cosmic balance, the one who ensured that the stars stayed in their courses and the sun rose each morning. Years continued to pass, so many years that numbers became meaningless. Atlas watched empires rise and fall, watched ice ages come and go, watched new species evolve and old ones disappear. Through it all, he held up the sky, a constant presence at the edge of the world. Eventually, even his physical form began to change. His feet grew deep roots into the earth. His arms became like the trunks of enormous trees. His hair transformed into forests, his tears into streams. He was becoming a mountain, the mountain that would later bear his name, standing at the border between the known world and the great ocean beyond. But his mind remained sharp, his awareness keen. From his transformed state, Atlas could perceive patterns that smaller beings couldn't see. The slow dance of continents across the Earth's surface, the gradual changes in climate and weather, the rise and fall of human civilizations like waves on a beach. And gradually Atlas came to understand something that had escaped him during his years of pride and rebellion. His punishment had become his purpose. By holding up the sky, he was performing the most essential service possible, making sure that life could continue, that the world remained stable enough for love and art and hope to flourish below. In some versions of the story, Atlas is eventually freed from his burden when Perseus shows him the head of Medusa, turning him to stone and ending his long vigil. In others, he carries the sky forever, the eternal guardian whose sacrifice makes all other life possible. But perhaps the most important part of Atlas's story isn't about punishment or redemption. It's about the way we all carry invisible burdens, and how those burdens can transform us if we're willing to accept them with grace rather than resentment. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, you might think about the things you carry that no one else can see. Responsibilities, worries, hopes for the people you love. Maybe those burdens feel impossibly heavy sometimes, like holding up the entire sky. But maybe Atlas's story reminds us that the heaviest burdens can also be the most meaningful ones. That sometimes what feels like punishment becomes purpose. That the weight we carry for others, whether it's a child who needs our strength, an aging parent who needs our care, or simply the everyday responsibility of showing up and doing our best, isn't separate from who we are. It becomes who we are. And just like Atlas, standing at the edge of the world with the infinite sky on his shoulders, we might discover that our burdens don't diminish us. They expand us, deepen us, connect us to something larger than ourselves. They teach us that love isn't just a feeling, it's a willingness to carry weight so that others can walk more lightly.